Hey y'all, thanks for being with me today. It's a beautiful Sunday here in Texas. The weather is like 65 to 70 degrees. Absolutely wonderful. So we're continuing today with chapter 5 of Lindsay Gibson's Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. Thanks to y'all who have been with me this entire time. If you're just picking this up and you're watching something similar on YouTube and then it popped up or whatever, you can check out our channel, and I have the starting from the very beginning here. Please pick up your own copy, have a journal handy, write down your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. Check out our site, www.findingyourselfsatx.com. As always, I'll go as far as I can into chapter 5 until my 30 minutes are up, and then we'll finish the chapter next week, okay? Chapter 5. How different children react to emotionally immature parenting. When immature parents can't engage emotionally and give their children enough attention or affection, their children cope by imagining healing fantasies about how their unmet emotional needs will be fulfilled in the future. They also cope by finding a special family role, creating what I call a role self. This role self is designed to get some kind of attention from a preoccupied parent. In this chapter, we'll begin by looking at healing fantasies and role selves, and then explore two very different coping styles that children use in order to deal with emotional neglect: internalizing and externalizing. Hold on, my daughter just dropped something. Unfortunately, neither coping style allows a child to fully develop his or her potential. Because of their parents' self-preoccupation, these children are likely to feel that their true selves aren't enough to engage their parents. As a result, they start believing that the only way to be noticed is to become something other than who they really are. Sadly, the true self, which consists of a child's innate aptitudes and genuine feelings, takes a backseat to what seems necessary to secure a place in the family. Although the true self still exists beneath the surface, it is often squelched by family rules that put the parents' needs first. In Chapter 7, we'll look at what happens when the underlying true self resurfaces to wake people up to their real feelings and full potential. But for now, let's look at how healing fantasies and family roles affect people in both childhood and adult life. The origins of healing fantasies. Having immature parents forces children to adjust to their parents' emotional limitations. Children react to emotionally immature parenting in a number of ways as they attempt to be noticed, cared for, and engaged with. But the one thing all emotionally deprived children have in common is coming up with a fantasy about how they will eventually get what they need. As children, we make sense of the world by putting together a story that explains our life to us. We imagine what would make us feel better and create what I call a healing fantasy, a hopeful story about what will make us truly happy one day. Children often think the cure for their childhood pain and emotional loneliness lies in finding a way to change themselves and other people into something other than what they really are. Healing fantasies all have that theme. Therefore, everyone's healing fantasy begins with, if only. For instance, people may think they'd be loved if only they were selfless or attractive enough, or if only they could find a sensitive, selfless partner. Or they may think their life would be healed by becoming famous or extremely rich, or making other people afraid of them. Unfortunately, the healing fantasy is a child's solution that comes from a child's mind, so it often doesn't fit adult realities. But whatever the healing fantasy, it gives a child the optimism to get through a painful upbringing in hopes of a better future. Many people have survived a miserable childhood this way. The hopeful fantasy of one day being loved and attended to keeps them going. How healing fantasies affect adult relationships. As we grow into adulthood, we secretly expect our closest relationships to make our healing fantasies come true. Our subconscious expectations for other people come straight from this childhood fantasy world. We believe that if we keep at it long enough, we will eventually get people to change. We might think our emotional loneliness will finally be healed by a partner who always thinks of our needs first, or a friend who never lets us down. Often, these unconscious fantasies are quite self-defeating. For example, one woman secretly believed that if only she could make her depressed father happy, she would finally be free in her own life to do what she wanted. She didn't realize she was already free to live her own life, even if her father stayed miserable. Another woman was sure she could get the kind of love she longed for from her husband if she did everything he wanted. When he still didn't give her the attention she thought she'd earned, she was furious with him. Her anger covered the anxiety she felt when she realized her healing story wasn't working, even though she'd given it her best shot. Since childhood, she had been sure she could make herself lovable by being a good person. We usually have no idea that we're trying to foist a healing fantasy on someone, but it can be seen in the little tests of love we put people through. It's easier for an outsider to see how unrealistic the fantasy is. Successful marital therapy often involves exposing how people's healing fantasies try to force their partners to give them the loving childhood they always wished for. Developing a role self. If your parents or caregivers didn't adequately respond to your true self in childhood, you'll figure out what you need to do to make a connection. Instead of just being who you are, you'll develop a role self or pseudo-self, Bowen 1978, that will give you a secure place in your family system. This role self gradually replaces the spontaneous expression of the true self. This role self might be based on a belief such as, I'll become so self-sacrificing that other people will praise me and love me. Or it might take the negative form of, I'll make them pay attention to me one way or the other. The process of assuming a role self is unconscious. Nobody sets out to do it deliberately. We create our role selves gradually through trial and error as we see the reactions of others. Regardless of whether a role self seems positive or negative, as children, we saw it as the best way to belong. Then, as adults, we tend to keep playing our role in hopes that someone will pay attention to us in the way we wished our parents had. You may wonder why all children don't make up wonderfully positive role selves, why so many people are acting out roles of failure, anger, mental disturbance, emotional volatility, or other forms of misery. One answer is that not every child has the inner resources to be successful and self-controlled in interactions with others. Some children's genetics and neurology propel them into impulsive reactivity instead of constructive action. Another reason negative role selves arise is that it's common for emotionally immature parents to subconsciously use different children in the family to express unresolved aspects of their own role self in healing fantasies. For instance, one child may be idealized and indulged as the perfect child, while the other is tagged as incompetent, always screwing up and needing help. How parents influence development of the role self. An example of a parent who pressures a child into a role self would be an insecure mother who reinforces the fears of a clingy, anxious child to give herself a secure role as the center of that child's life. Finally, someone really needs me. Another example would be a father with unresolved feelings of inadequacy who belittles his son in order to feel strong and capable in comparison. I'm the competent one who has to correct everyone else. Or perhaps both parents turn a blind eye to their own underlying anger and self-centeredness and see these traits in the child instead. We're loving parents, but our kid is mean and disrespectful. Few parents consciously intend to undermine their child's future, but their own anxieties may make them see their own negative, undesired qualities in their children. This is a powerful psychological defensive reaction that's beyond their conscious control. As a child, if you found a role that fit your parents' needs, like a key in a lock, you probably would have quickly identified with this role self. In the process, your true self would have become more invisible as you transformed into what your family system needed you to be. This kind of divestment from your true self can sabotage your intimate relationships as an adult. You can't forge a deep and satisfying relationship from the position of a role self. You have to be able to express enough of your true self to give the other person something real to relate to. Without that, the relationship is just play acting between two role selves. Another problem with this role self is that it doesn't have its own source of energy. It has to steal vitality from the true self. Playing a role is much more tiring than just being yourself because it takes a huge effort to be something you are not. And because it's made up, the role self is insecure and afraid of being revealed as an imposter. Playing a role self usually doesn't work in the long run because it can never completely hide people's true inclinations. Sooner or later, their genuine needs will bubble up. When people decide to stop playing the role and live more from their true self, they can go forward with more lightness and vitality. Exercise. Identifying your healing fantasy and role self. You'll need two pieces of paper for this exercise. At the top, Title 1, Healing Fantasy, and the other, Role Self. The first part of this exercise will help you explore and identify your own healing fantasy. At the top of your healing fantasy page, copy and complete the following sentences. Don't think too much about it. Just write down what immediately comes to you. I wish other people were more. Why is it so hard for people to? For a change, I would love someone to treat me like. Maybe one of these days I'll find someone who will. In an ideal world with good people, other people would. Okay, so that's your healing fantasy. Now, we'll use a similar process to help you discover your role self. On your role self page, copy and complete the following sentences, again, writing down the first thing that comes to mind. I try hard to be. The main reason people like me is because other people don't appreciate how much I always have to be the one who. I've tried to be the kind of person who. After completing the sentences, use words and ideas from your responses to write 2 short descriptions, one for your healing fantasy and one for your role self. These descriptions will reveal your secret ideas about how other people should change in order to make you feel valued and how you think you must behave to be loved. Finally, write a short summary about what it's been like trying to get others to change and how it has felt to play the role self you described in this exercise. Do you want to keep these fantasies and roles? Or are you ready to explore and express your true individuality? If you're ready to live more in keeping with your true self, the rest of this book will help you do just that. Sorry, I'm looking to see how many pages we have left. So this exercise, when I was first reading the book, this exercise I think, you need to take some time, do the exercise, really think about it, maybe pause this video, don't continue with the rest of the video until you really take some time to do it. It's also the type of thing where, like, as I'm reading this, and this is maybe like the 5th time I'm reading it, I'm thinking of new things, right? And so I think it's important that if you have your own copy of the book, Read the chapter, read it once. Don't try to do the exercise right away. Then come back to it, do it again. It is tedious, but this type of self-reflective work, it's not so easy. Like, you don't have the answer the very first time that you look at the question typically. And she doesn't want you to overthink it, right? She wants you to just put the first thing that comes to mind. So I'm not saying like take a long time in answering the questions, but maybe just if you write down your answers and then you look back at it and you don't necessarily like what you wrote, that's okay. Because she's trying to get you to just like react, right? React and write it down. And then you might not agree with what you wrote down because you don't consciously know your healing fantasy or your role self. And what do you mean I've been play acting like this is me, right? So how do you get from, like, how do you actually wrap your head around the fact that you do have a healing fantasy and you do have a role self and you imagine that things could be a certain way and you keep trying, and kind of what she's trying to get at, and we'll get more into this as we go into the book, but what she's trying to get at is that often you're banging your head against the wall. And yes, someone could change. They really could. It just has to be that it's them. Like, it can't come from you. Nothing that you do is going to make them change one way or another. And oftentimes we try so hard to try and mend relations with our family or just be the nice guy, to the point of like allowing ourselves to become the victim in some ways. And that's what she's trying to avoid. And the rest of the book will go into that in a little bit more detail. So hopefully you did the exercise, you have your pieces of paper. Please do pause this video, ponder on it, come back, take the book, rip the pages, throw it apart, pick it back up, tape it together. You need to actually give yourself some time, because this type of work is not so easy. And in my own journey, right, there's a lot of things that I've discovered about myself that I don't necessarily like. And I think that's the same with everyone, whenever you're doing kind of like self-reflection. So, okay. I was going to try and stop here, but I think there's a lot left. So I'll continue up to the 30 minutes like I promised. 2 styles of coping with emotionally immature parents. Healing fantasies and role selves are as unique as the children who invent them. But overall, children with emotionally immature parents cope with emotional deprivation in one of 2 ways: either internalizing their problems or externalizing them. Children who are internalizers believe it's up to them to change things, whereas externalizers expect others to do it for them. In some circumstances, a child might hold both beliefs, but most children primarily adopt one coping style or the other as they struggle to get their needs met. Which style you've adopted is probably more a matter of personality and constitution than choice. And ultimately, both styles are an attempt to get needs met. As people move through life, they may go through periods of being more internalizing or more externalizing, but their basic nature is likely to lean more one way than the other. However, the ideal is to balance these 2 approaches so that internalizers learn to seek help externally from others, and externalizers learn to look inside of themselves for control. Internalizers. Internalizers are mentally active and love to learn things. They try to solve problems from the inside out by being self-reflective and trying to learn from their mistakes. They're sensitive and try to understand cause and effect. Seeing life as an opportunity to develop themselves, they enjoy becoming more competent. They believe they can make things better by trying harder, and they instinctively take responsibility for solving problems on their own. Their main sources of anxiety are feeling guilty when they displease others, and the fear of being exposed as imposters. Their biggest relationship downfall is being overly self-sacrificing and then becoming resentful of how much they do for others. Externalizers. Externalizers take action before they think about things. They're reactive and they do things impulsively to blow off anxiety quickly. They tend not to be self-reflective, assigning blame to other people and circumstances rather than their own actions. They experience life as a process of trial and error, but rarely use their mistakes to learn how to do better in the future. They're firmly attached to the notion that things need to change in the outside world in order for them to be happy, believing that if only other people would give them what they want, their problems would be solved. Their coping style is frequently so self-defeating and disruptive that other people have to step in to repair the damage from their impulsive actions. Externalizers feel that competent people owe them help and tend to believe that good things have come to other people rather unfairly. Regarding self-image, they either have a very low self-confidence or a sense of inflated superiority. They depend on external soothing, which makes them susceptible to substance abuse, addictive relationships, and many forms of immediate gratification. Their main source of anxiety is that they will be cut off from the external sources their security depends on. Their biggest relationship problems include being attracted to impulsive people and being overly dependent on others for support and stability. Understanding the externalizer's worldview. It's hard to know which coping style is worse. Internalizers certainly suffer more consciously, but their tendency to blame themselves has the silver lining of eliciting reassurance and support from others. In contrast, externalizers engage in behaviors that often exasperate and anger others. So when they need help, others typically want to keep their distance. However, externalizers usually keep acting up until somebody steps in to help them. Conversely, internalizers may suffer in silence and continue to look just fine, even as they're breaking down inside. Often, people don't offer internalizers assistance because they don't realize they need it. This book will probably appeal mostly to people who are internalizers because it's designed to help people understand themselves and others, which typically isn't a strong interest of externalizers. Still, it's important for internalizers to understand the worldview of externalizers in order to deal with them more effectively, especially because most emotionally immature parents are externalizers and struggle against reality rather than coping with it. They blame the outside world for their problems, as if reality were at fault. If you think this sounds like the behavior of a young child, you're exactly right. Externalizing keeps people from growing psychologically and is therefore associated with emotional immaturity. Internalizing, on the other hand, promotes psychological development through the use of self-reflection. Because I'll cover internalizers in depth in Chapter 6, the rest of this chapter discusses various aspects of externalizing. Externalizers create a vicious cycle of self-defeat. Externalizing tends to elicit punishment and rejection. In contrast to well-behaved internalizers, externalizers act out their anxiety, pain, or depression. They do impulsive things to distract themselves from their immediate problems. Although this may help them feel better temporarily, it creates more problems down the road. When externalizers have to face the consequences of their impulsivity, they're vulnerable to strong but brief feelings of shame and failure. However, they usually use denial to avoid shame rather than wondering how they might need to change. This lands them in a vicious cycle of impulsivity, followed by feelings of failure that prompt still more impulsivity. As a result, externalizers repeatedly feel brief outbursts of low self-worth and a sense of being bad. To avoid total self-hatred, they rid themselves of shame by blaming others and making excuses. This strategy doesn't win them much sympathy, except among fellow externalizers, so they often end up without the emotional support they were seeking. Externalizers seek solutions outside themselves. Externalizers don't get a chance to grow or learn from mistakes because they expel stress as soon as it hits. Believing their problems need to be solved by someone else, they look to others to make them feel better, sometimes with a hint of resentment about not being helped sooner. You might picture them as always looking for an external power source to plug into, while internalizers have their batteries included. Of course, Sometimes internalizers need a recharge, but they don't routinely make their problems someone else's issue. Left unchecked, an early externalizing coping style results in emotional immaturity. Most emotionally immature parents have an externalizing coping style. Because they're always looking outside themselves to feel better, externalizers don't work to develop better self-control. They get overwhelmed by emotion and either deny the seriousness of their problems or blame other people. Externalizers think reality should conform to their wishes, whereas more mature people deal with reality and adapt to it. Valiant 2000. Externalizing in children promotes emotional dependency and enmeshment with the parents' dynamics. Bowen, 1978. Further, emotionally immature parents may indulge an externalizing child because doing so distracts them from their own unresolved issues. When dealing with an out-of-control child, parents don't have time to think about their own pain from the past. Instead, they can take on the role self of the strong parent, helping a weak, independent child who couldn't get along without them. Although externalizing children often struggle with behavioral problems, impulsivity, emotional volatility, and even addictions, these ways of acting out have the advantage of making their distress visible. Their pain doesn't stay unseen as it does with internalizers, though it may be misinterpreted as defiance, opposition, or senseless troublemaking. Externalizers exist along a continuum of severity. Externalizing exists along a continuum of severity. I swear I didn't read the same line twice. It was the same line twice. Proof. At the extreme end are predatory, sociopathic people who see others as resources to exploit with no regard for their rights or feelings. Milder or quieter externalizers can look like internalizers because they're so non-confrontational, but they can be identified by their belief that others should change. That said, milder externalizers may be amenable to growth and self-reflection as they get older. An example of a mild externalizer was a man who came to therapy because he frequently lost control when stressed and shouted at his wife and kids. He had been raised in a rigid family in which he was hit and humiliated if he made a mistake, so he had plenty of role models for externalizing behavior. However, because he sincerely wanted things to be better at home, he worked hard to accept his wife and children as sensitive people in their own right, who needed to be worked with rather than overpowered. Mild externalizers can show up in many forms. As mentioned, on the surface, they may even seem to be internalizers. A key to this is whether they blame others for their unhappiness. As in the next story. Rodney's story. On the surface, Rodney seemed to be an empathetic internalizer who tried to keep everybody happy. He allowed his wife, Sasha, to tell him what he could and couldn't do, giving her full veto power over his activities. He came to therapy because he was depressed and felt he had lost himself. He was afraid of making Sasha mad and never challenged her because he feared she would leave him. Outwardly, he declared himself responsible for his choices, but he secretly blamed Sasha for restricting his life. In true externalizing fashion, he saw her as controlling his happiness and unhappiness and felt that he wasn't free to do what he wanted without her permission. Rodney had grown up with an overbearing mother who didn't give him much real nurturance, and as an adult, he still saw himself in the role of an overpowered child, now controlled by Sasha. In one therapy session, he pictured himself as a prisoner, a man in chains, a highly externalizing image. Rodney's wasn't flamboyantly demanding like many externalizers, but just the same, he believed the solutions to his problems were up to someone else. Until he began to recognize this dynamic, he remained just as stuck in his problems as a more severe externalizer. Fortunately, after being in therapy a while, Rodney saw what he'd been doing and began to speak up for himself. Sasha had no idea he was so upset. She had simply been taking the lead because Rodney never expressed his wishes. All right, y'all, we're at the 30-minute mark. We have a few pages left in this chapter. Super glad that you're here with me today. It's, I don't know, last day of January, I believe. Like I said, the Texas weather is beautiful, so maybe I'll go with my daughter for a little walk or something. I hope y'all are doing well. Check out our site, please. Call us for a consult. Email me, email Penny. First consult is always free, so definitely looking forward to chatting with you. And thank you for watching our videos, and see you next week. Take care.